In the quiet streets of Stevenage, England, where seven-time Formula One world champion Lewis Hamilton first dreamed of racing glory, there's a small house with fading photographs on the mantelpiece. They tell the story of a boy's journey from local go-kart tracks to global stardom, and of the ordinary family who helped make it possible. Now, decades after driving young Lewis to the races his hard-working father couldn't attend, James Taylor faces a life-threatening heart condition requiring experimental treatment his insurance won't cover. As medical bills mount, the family, that never asked for recognition, finds themselves at a crossroads, unaware that their long-ago acts of kindness are about to come full circle in ways they never imagined. The alarm clock rang at 5:30 a.m. in the small house on a quiet street in Stevenage, England. Anthony Hamilton reached over and turned it off quickly so it wouldn't wake 10-year-old Lewis, who was still sleeping down the hall. But Lewis wasn't asleep. He was wide awake, staring at the poster of Ayrton Senna on his bedroom wall. "Dad?" Lewis called out, his voice eager. "Is it time to go yet?" Anthony smiled as he walked into his son's room. Lewis was already sitting up in bed, his racing helmet clutched in his small hands. "Not for another 3 hours, champ," Anthony said. "The race doesn't start until 10, but I've got to go to work first." Lewis's face fell. "But what if we're late?" "We won't be late," Anthony promised. "I'll be back at 9 to pick you up." Anthony. Hamilton worked 3 jobs to pay for his son's go-kart racing. On weekdays, he was a computer technician. On weekends, he worked at the rail station and handed out flyers for local businesses. Every extra pound went to Lewis's racing: kart parts, entry fees, and gas money to drive to tracks all over England. That morning in 1995, Anthony left for his early shift, while Lewis got his racing gear ready. He laid out his gloves, his lucky socks, and the jacket that was still a bit too big for him. Lewis couldn't read the fancy clock in the living room yet, so he turned on the TV and waited for the cartoon shows to finish. When the news came on, he knew it was 9 o'clock, but 9 o'clock came and went. Then 9:15. Then 9:30. Lewis stood by the window, watching for his dad's car. The Rye House kart circuit was 30 minutes away. If they didn't leave soon, he would miss the practice laps before his race. Across the street, Sarah Taylor noticed the small boy at the window. She had seen Anthony leave early that morning and knew Lewis was waiting alone. She had her own son, Mike, who was 12 and went to the same school as Lewis. "James," she called to her husband. "Isn't that the Hamilton boy? He's been standing there for almost an hour." James Taylor looked out their kitchen window. Maybe Anthony got held up at work. He's been taking all those extra shifts lately. At 9:45, the phone rang in the Hamilton house. Lewis ran to answer it. "Lewis? It's Dad. The train is delayed, and there's no one to cover my shift. I can't get away until at least 10:30. Lewis felt tears coming to his eyes. "But Dad, my race is at 10:30. If I don't get there for practice, I'll have to start at the back of the grid. I'm sorry, son. I'm trying my best to—" There was a knock at the door. Lewis, still holding the phone, went to answer it. Mr. and Mrs. Taylor from across the street were standing there with their son, Mike. "Everything all right, Lewis?" Mrs. Taylor asked. "We noticed you waiting by the window." Lewis looked down at his racing shoes. "My dad's stuck at work. I might miss my race today." Anthony could hear the conversation through the phone. "Lewis, who's there?" he asked. Mrs. Taylor gently took the phone. "Hello, Anthony. It's Sarah from across the street. James and I were wondering if Lewis needed a ride to his race. We'd be happy to take him." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Anthony Hamilton was a proud man who didn't like asking for help. But he loved his son more than his pride. That would be very kind of you," he finally said. It's at Rye House Kart Circuit. Lewis knows where his kart is stored. 15 minutes later, Lewis was sitting in the Taylor's blue minivan. His racing gear was neatly packed in the back. Mike sat next to him, asking questions about go-karts and how fast they could go. 60 miles per hour, Lewis said excitedly. And the track at Rye House has a big sweeping corner where you can overtake if you brake really late. Mr. Taylor smiled as he drove. You really know your racing, don't you? Lewis nodded seriously. I'm going to be Formula One world champion someday, just like Ayrton Senna. Mrs. Taylor turned around from the front seat. Well, you can't be a champion if you're late for your race. James, can you go a bit faster? They arrived at Rye House with 10 minutes to spare before practice. As Lewis climbed out of the car with his gear, he turned to the Taylors. Thank you for driving me, he said politely, just as his father had taught him. Our pleasure, Mrs. Taylor replied. We'll stay and watch you race. Your dad said he'll be here as soon as he can. Lewis nodded and ran off to the pit area where the karts were lined up. The Taylors found seats in the small viewing area and watched as the little boy in the slightly too big racing suit climbed into his kart. They had no idea they had just become part of something much bigger than a simple favor for a neighbor, something that would change all their lives forever. Lewis lined up his kart for practice alongside the other young racers. Some had fancy helmets with special designs. Others had fathers who were mechanics or who raced themselves. Lewis just had his second-hand kart that Anthony had fixed up with parts bought from newspaper ads. From the stands, Mike Taylor watched with growing interest. Mom, that kart is going really fast, he said, as Lewis zoomed past. He certainly knows what he's doing, Mr. Taylor replied, surprised at how skillfully the small boy handled the machine. 20 minutes into practice, Anthony Hamilton arrived, still wearing his work uniform. He hurried over to the Taylors, slightly out of breath. I can't thank you enough, he said, shaking Mr. Taylor's hand. Lewis has been talking about this race all week. Mrs. Taylor smiled. It was no trouble at all. Your boy's quite the driver. Anthony's face lit up with pride. He really is. Been that way since he was 5 and I got him his first radio-controlled car. Never seen anything like it. They watched the qualifying session together. Lewis started in 4th position but quickly moved up to 2nd by the first corner. His kart wasn't the fastest, but he found racing lines that the other kids missed. Does he race every weekend? Mrs. Taylor asked. Anthony nodded. As many as we can afford. It's not cheap. I can imagine, said Mr. Taylor. I work as a mechanic at the Ford garage. If you ever need help with your car or the kart, just let me know. By the final lap of the race, Lewis was right behind the leader. At the last corner, he saw a gap and went for it. The two karts touched slightly, but Lewis kept his nerve and crossed the finish line first. He won! Mike shouted, jumping up. Dad, did you see that move? The Taylors clapped and cheered while Anthony rushed to the finish area. They watched. As father and son hugged, Lewis's helmet still on, making him look even smaller next to his dad. That evening, there was a knock at the Taylors' door. Lewis stood there holding a small trophy. I wanted to show you what I won, he said shyly, and to say thank you again. Mrs. Taylor invited him in. We were just having some cake. Would you like a piece? While Lewis ate his cake at the kitchen table, Anthony explained to the Taylors how the next race was at Buckmore Park in Kent, a much bigger track. The problem is, he said quietly, so Lewis wouldn't hear, it's next Saturday, and my boss just told me I have to work a double shift. I can't get out of it. Mrs. Taylor glanced at her husband, who nodded slightly. We could take him, she offered. We don't have plans that weekend, and Mike seemed to enjoy watching today. I couldn't ask you to do that, Anthony started. But Mr. Taylor cut him off. "You're not asking. We're offering." "Kent's what? An hour and a half away? We can make a day of it." And so, the following Saturday, the Taylors picked Lewis up at 7 a.m. Mrs. Taylor had packed lunches for everyone, and Mr. Taylor had read up about go-karts so he could help Lewis set up. Buckmore Park was much bigger than Rye House. There were more carts, more people, and the track wound through trees and hills. Lewis looked nervous as he unpacked his gear. "There are some really good drivers here," he said quietly. Mrs. Taylor knelt down to his level. "And you're one of them. Just drive like you did last week." The practice session was difficult. Lewis spun out twice, trying to find the limits of the track. When he came back to the pits, Mr. Taylor helped him adjust the cart's setup. "The back end seems loose," Mr. Taylor said, recalling what he'd read. "Let's tighten this up a bit." Lewis looked surprised. "That's exactly what it feels like." "How did you know, Mr.?" Taylor winked. "I fix cars for a living. The principles aren't that different." With the adjusted cart, Lewis qualified in 6th place. It wasn't as good as he hoped, but better than he feared. Before the race, he looked around at the other drivers, with their families and professional-looking equipment. "You belong here just as much as they do," Mrs. Taylor reassured him. "Now, show them why." When the race started, Lewis was cautious at first, but lap by lap, he grew more confident. He passed one cart, then another. By the halfway point, he was in 3rd place. "He's flying!" Mike shouted, now fully invested in Lewis's race. On the final lap, Lewis made a bold move around the outside of a corner and moved into 2nd place. The crowd gasped. It was a risky but brilliant maneuver. After the race, Lewis couldn't stop smiling, even though he hadn't won. "Did you see that pass?" he kept asking. "I've never done that before." Later, at a payphone near the track, Lewis called his dad. "Dad, I got 2nd place. The trophy is almost as big as the 1st place one." The Taylors watched as Lewis described every lap to his father. They could see how much the boy missed having Anthony there, but also how proud he was to tell him about his achievement. On the drive home, Lewis fell asleep in the back seat, clutching his trophy. Mrs. Taylor looked back at him and whispered to her husband, "He's really something special, isn't he?" Mr. Taylor nodded. "Anthony's got his hands full with that one, and with his work schedule." "Maybe we could help out more often," Mrs. Taylor suggested. "Mike seems to enjoy it too." They didn't realize it then, but that simple suggestion would lead them to tracks all across England, and eventually to witnessing the rise of one of the greatest racing drivers in history. Over the next few months, the Taylors fell into a routine. When Anthony couldn't take Lewis to races because of work, they would step in. Their blue minivan became a familiar sight at kart tracks around southern England. PF International next weekend, Mr. Taylor announced one Friday evening in the spring of 1996. "That's all the way up in Lincolnshire." "That's a 3-hour drive," Mrs. Taylor exclaimed. "Lewis says it's the biggest kart track in the country," Mike added excitedly. "All the best drivers race there." Mrs. Taylor began planning. "We'll need to leave very early. I'll pack extra sandwiches and thermoses of hot chocolate." The morning of the PF International race, they picked up Lewis at 5 a.m. Anthony was there to help load the cart into the minivan. "I really appreciate this," he told the Taylors for what must have been the 100th time. "I've been saving for a newer engine for Lewis, so these extra shifts help." "It's our pleasure," Mrs. Taylor replied honestly. In truth, she and her family had grown to love race days. There was something special about watching Lewis drive, a natural talent that was obvious even to people who knew nothing about racing. PF International was indeed massive compared to the local tracks they were used to. The course twisted and turned through a complex layout with long straights and tight hairpin bends. Lewis's eyes were wide as they arrived. "This is where the British Championships are held," he whispered, almost in awe. The competition was fierce. Drivers had come from all over the UK, and some even from Europe. Many had expensive carts with the latest equipment. Lewis's second-hand machine looked out of place among them. In the pit area, Mr. Taylor helped Lewis prepare his cart. He'd been reading racing magazines and learning about setup from watching other teams. Lewis trusted his advice now, and together they made adjustments for the track conditions. "Remember, it's not about having the best equipment," Mr. Taylor told Lewis. "It's about how you use what you have." Lewis nodded seriously. At 11 years old, he was still small for his age, but his focus and determination made him seem much older. The qualifying session was difficult. Lewis managed only 12th place on the grid. Back in the pits, he looked disappointed. "The cart feels slow on the straights," he explained. "The other kids just drive past me." "Then you'll have to be better in the corners," Mrs. Taylor encouraged him. "Find the places they can't pass you." Lewis considered this, then nodded. "I can brake later than them. I know I can." When the race began, Lewis stayed in the middle of the pack, but lap after lap, he found little advantages. Braking a fraction later, taking slightly different lines through corners, by the halfway point, he had moved up to 8th place. "He's doing it!" Mike shouted from the viewing area. "He's picking them off one by one." On the final lap, Lewis was in 6th place, battling with a boy in a much newer cart. At the last hairpin, Lewis dived to the inside, a move so bold that the Taylors held their breath. The carts came so close they almost touched, but Lewis emerged ahead and crossed the finish line in 5th place. After the race, a tall man in a McLaren team jacket approached Anthony, who had arrived just in time to see the final laps after finishing his shift. "Your son has exceptional car control," the man said. "How long has he been racing?" "About 3 years," Anthony replied proudly. "Keep at it," the man said, handing Anthony a business card. "We're always looking for talent." On the drive home, Lewis was unusually quiet, holding his 5th-place trophy. "Everything okay, Lewis?" Mrs. Taylor asked, turning around from the front seat. "I was just thinking," Lewis replied. "If I had a better engine, I could have won today." Mr. Taylor caught his eye in the rearview mirror. "Maybe, but winning with less makes you a better driver." "My dad says that too," Lewis nodded. "He says we can't buy our way to the top, so I have to be twice as good." "Your dad's a wise man," Mr. Taylor said, "and he works harder than anyone I know to give you these opportunities." That December, something amazing happened. Lewis, now in his 2nd full year of competitive karting, was invited to the Autosport Awards in London, a prestigious event where the motorsport world gathered to celebrate the season. Anthony couldn't afford a ticket for himself and Lewis, but someone from the Karting Association had arranged for them to attend. The Taylors watched Lewis leave that evening, dressed in his first-ever suit, looking both nervous and excited. The next day, Lewis burst into the Taylors' house without even knocking, something he had never done before. "I met Ron Dennis," he exclaimed, breathless with excitement. "The boss of McLaren." "The Formula One team?" Mr. Taylor asked. Amazed, Lewis nodded rapidly. "I went up to him and told him I was going to race for his team one day. And guess what? He said, 'Come and see me in 9 years.'" Mrs. Taylor laughed at his enthusiasm. "And will you?" Lewis's face grew serious, showing that focused look they had come to know. "I won't need 9 years. I'm going to do it sooner." None of them knew how prophetic those words would be. Throughout 1997, Lewis's reputation in karting grew. The Taylors took him to races at Larkhall in Scotland, Rora in Cumbria, and even a special event in Wales. Anthony joined them whenever he could, but his work schedule remained demanding. Mrs. Taylor began keeping a scrapbook of Lewis's races, collecting newspaper clippings and race programs. Lewis had begun to win more regularly now, and each trophy seemed bigger than the last. Then, in late 1997, Anthony received a phone call that changed everything. McLaren was inviting Lewis to join their young driver program. Ron Dennis hadn't forgotten the bold young boy from the awards ceremony. When Lewis turned 13 in January 1998, he was officially signed to McLaren's program. The local newspaper in Stevenage ran a small story about it, which Mrs. Taylor carefully cut out and added to her growing collection. "This is just the beginning," she told her husband that night. "That boy is going all the way to Formula One. You mark my words." Little did they know how their lives would continue to intertwine with Lewis's remarkable journey, a journey they had helped make possible with a simple offer of a ride to a racetrack. Being signed to McLaren's Young Driver program meant that Lewis had official support now. The famous racing team provided coaching, equipment, and even helped with some travel expenses. But it wasn't enough to cover everything. "They're sending me to race in Italy next month," Lewis told the Taylors one spring afternoon in 1998. He was 13 now, growing taller but still with the same bright eyes and focused expression. "Dad's trying to figure out how to afford the extra costs. Racing in Europe was a big step up. The competition would be fiercer and the expenses higher." Anthony was still working multiple jobs, but even with McLaren's support, international racing stretched the Hamilton budget thin. "Italy, eh?" Mr. Taylor said, exchanging a glance with his wife. "I've always wanted to see Italy." Mrs. Taylor caught his meaning immediately. "I wonder if we could schedule our holiday around your race, Lewis. Which part of Italy is it in?" Lewis's face lit up. "It's near Naples, at a track called Sarno." "You'd really come all that way?" "Well, Mike's been wanting to go abroad," Mrs. Taylor said, smiling at her son, who nodded eagerly. "And we could help with transportation while we're there." When they told Anthony about their plans, he tried to refuse at first. "You've done too much already," he insisted. "I can't ask you to spend your family holiday following Lewis around racetracks." "You're not asking, we're offering," Mr. Taylor replied, using the same words he had said years ago when this all began. "Besides, we enjoy it. Right, Mike?" Mike, who was 15 now and had become like a big brother to Lewis, nodded. "It's more exciting than sitting on a beach all week." The race in Italy was Lewis's first major international competition. The track was faster than anything he'd raced on in England, and the Italian and German drivers knew every inch of it. In the pit area, Lewis looked nervous for the first time in years. "They're all so fast here," he whispered to Mr. Taylor while they prepared his kart. Mr. Taylor adjusted the front wing slightly. "So are you. Just focus on your driving, not theirs." During practice, Lewis struggled to find his rhythm. He finished each session in the middle of the pack, frustration evident on his face. That evening at their small rented apartment, Mrs. Taylor noticed he hardly touched his dinner. "You know," she said gently, "many great champions had difficult first races abroad." Lewis looked up. "Did Senna?" "Probably," she replied. "Everyone has to learn sometime. That's why you're here, to learn." The next day in qualifying, Lewis found something extra. He pushed harder than before, taking risks that made the Taylors hold their breath. When the session ended, he had qualified in 4th place. "That's my boy," Anthony shouted from the pit wall. He had managed to get the weekend off work to come to Italy, though he'd had to sleep on the couch in the Taylors' rental to save money. The race itself was intense. Lewis battled with drivers who had been competing internationally for years. He fell back to 6th at the start, but fought his way forward lap after lap. With 2 laps to go, Lewis was in 3rd place, chasing the 2nd-place driver. The Taylors and Anthony were shouting themselves hoarse from the stands. "He's going to do it!" Mike yelled as Lewis made a move into the final corner. The 2 karts ran side by side, wheels almost touching. Lewis held his line and emerged ahead, securing 2nd place in his first international race. The celebration that night was joyful. Anthony took everyone out for pizza, spending money he couldn't really afford, but wanting to mark the occasion. "To Lewis!" Mr. Taylor toasted, raising his glass of soda since they didn't drink alcohol around the boys. "Future world champion! And to all of you," Lewis added shyly, "for helping me get here." Back in England, Lewis's racing schedule became more demanding. McLaren wanted him racing almost every weekend, all across Europe. Anthony still accompanied him whenever possible, but there were many times when work commitments kept him away. On those weekends, Lewis would often stay with the Taylors the night before flying out. Mrs. Taylor would help him pack, making sure he had everything he needed. One Christmas, the Taylors gave Lewis a pair of racing gloves he had been eyeing for months but couldn't afford. His face, when he opened the gift, was something Mrs. Taylor would never forget. "These are professional grade," he gasped, running his fingers over the fine leather. "How did you know?" "You only mentioned it about 20 times, Mike teased, but he was smiling too. That winter, Lewis faced another challenge. Some boys at school had begun bullying him about his racing. "They say I think I'm better than everyone else," he confided to Mike one day, "that I'll never make it to Formula One." Mike, who had grown protective of his younger friend, put an arm around his shoulders. "They're just jealous. You're doing something amazing while they're just talking about it." When Lewis won the British Cadet Karting Championship that year, Mrs. Taylor made sure to cut out every newspaper article and add it to her growing collection. The scrapbook now filled 3 volumes, carefully documenting every step of Lewis's journey. As the young driver moved up to more powerful karts and higher categories, the Taylors remained his steadfast supporters. They were there to celebrate his victories and comfort him after rare defeats. They had become, in every way that mattered, a second family. The years seemed to fly by. By 2001, Lewis was 16 years old and ready for his next big step, Formula Betis Renault. It was his first move into real racing cars, away from karts. The vehicles were faster, more powerful, and much more expensive. "It doesn't even look like the same sport," Mrs. Taylor remarked, as they watched Lewis's first Formula Renault test at Brands Hatch Circuit in Kent. The sleek, open-wheel cars were a far cry from the go-karts where Lewis had started. "He's growing. Up," Mr. Taylor replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "Look at him out there. Not a trace of nerves." McLaren's support had increased as Lewis progressed. The team now covered most of his racing expenses and provided professional coaches and engineers. Anthony no longer had to work 3 jobs, though. He still put in long hours to help with the remaining costs. The Taylors still attended races when they could, but their role had changed. They were no longer needed to drive Lewis to events or help set up his equipment. Now they were simply there as fans and friends, watching from the grandstands instead of the pit area. In 2002, Lewis dominated the Formula Renault UK Championship. His name began appearing in motorsport magazines and occasionally in national newspapers. People in Stevenage started to recognize him as that racing driver who lives here. When Lewis came home between races, he would often stop by the Taylors' house. Though he was becoming famous in racing circles, with them, he was still just Lewis from across the street. "Did you see that pass I made at Silverstone?" he would ask excitedly, showing them videos of his races. The team said no one had tried that line before. Mrs. Taylor always had his favorite cookies waiting, and Mr. Taylor would listen intently as Lewis described the technical aspects of his driving. Mike, now in university, would come home on weekends when Lewis was racing nearby. "You're going to be signing autographs soon," Mike teased after Lewis won a particularly important race. "Don't forget us little people," Lewis had laughed. As if I could. You guys saw me when I was just a kid with a dream. By 2005, Lewis had moved up to Formula 3, another step closer to his Formula 1 goal. The races were now televised on sports channels, and the Taylors would gather around their TV when they couldn't attend in person. "There he is," Mrs. Taylor would exclaim whenever the camera showed Lewis. "Our boy." Lewis won the Formula 3 Euro Series championship that year, beating drivers from all over the world. His victory made headlines in major newspapers, and rumors began circulating that McLaren was considering him for a Formula 1 seat sooner rather than later. During the Christmas holiday, Lewis visited the Taylors with a gift. It was a framed photo of him standing on the podium with his Formula 3 trophy. He had signed it, "To the Taylors, who helped make this possible. With love, Lewis." Mrs. Taylor had tears in her eyes as she hung it on their living room wall. "Look how far he's come from that little boy waiting by the window." In 2006, Lewis moved up to GP2, the final stepping stone before Formula 1. The races were now held alongside Formula 1 events at famous tracks like Monaco and Monza. The GP2 cars were nearly as fast as F1 machines, and the competition was fierce. The season was a battle from start to finish, but Lewis emerged as champion, winning races with overtaking moves that left commentators speechless. After particularly impressive victories, he would call the Taylors from the track. "Did you see it? Were you watching?" he would ask, still breathless with excitement. "We wouldn't miss it for the world," Mr. Taylor would reply. "Your dad must be over the moon." Then, in November 2006, the news they had all been waiting for finally came. McLaren announced that Lewis Hamilton would race for their Formula 1 team in 2007, partnering with the reigning world champion Fernando Alonso. The Stevenage local newspaper ran the story on its front page. "Local boy achieves Formula 1 dream." Mrs. Taylor cut it out carefully and added it to her collection, which now filled a whole shelf. When Lewis came to tell them in person, he seemed almost in shock himself. "I still can't believe it," he said, sitting in their familiar kitchen where he had eaten countless meals over the years. "Formula 1, just like I said I would." "We never doubted you for a second," Mrs. Taylor said, giving him a warm hug. None of them could have predicted what would happen next, how Lewis would take the Formula 1 world by storm and come within a single point of winning the championship in his very first season. The 2007 Formula 1 season began in Australia. The Taylors gathered around their television set to watch Lewis's first race. They had decorated their living room with small checkered flags and had even baked a cake for the occasion. "I'm so nervous I can hardly watch," Mrs. Taylor said, as the cars lined up on the starting grid. Lewis was qualifying fourth, an impressive result for a rookie. "He'll be fine," Mr. Taylor assured her, though he was gripping the arms of his chair tightly. When Lewis finished the race in third place, standing on the podium in his first-ever Formula 1 Grand Prix, the Taylors cheered so loudly that their neighbors came over to see what the commotion was about. "That's our boy," Mr. Taylor kept saying, pointing at the TV screen where Lewis was spraying champagne. "We used to drive him to kart races, and now look at him." As the season progressed, Lewis continued to impress. He scored podium after podium, and by mid-season, he was leading the championship ahead of his teammate Fernando Alonso and Ferrari's Kimi Raikkonen. In June, Lewis called the Taylors with exciting news. "I've arranged for you to come to the British Grand Prix as my guests," he told them. "VIP passes and everything. You'll be in the McLaren garage with Dad." The British Grand Prix at Silverstone was a dream come true for the Taylors. They walked through the paddock, amazed at being behind the scenes of a Formula One race. Famous drivers and team owners brushed past them. Television cameras followed Lewis wherever he went. "It's like being in another world," Mrs. Taylor whispered as they entered the McLaren garage. Lewis spotted them and immediately came over, giving them each a hug despite the cameras watching his every move. "I wouldn't be here without you," he told them quietly. "I wanted you to see it all up close." Lewis won the race that day, his first victory on home soil. As he stood on the top step of the podium, Union Jack in hand, the Taylors cried tears of joy. The 2007 season came down to the final race in Brazil. Lewis was leading the championship and needed only to finish fifth or better to become world champion in his rookie year, something that had never been done before. The Taylors declined Lewis's offer to fly them to Brazil. "We've watched most of your career from our living room," Mr. Taylor told him. "It seems right to watch this final step from here, too." Race day was tense. The Taylors barely spoke as the cars lined up on the grid. Lewis had a good start, but then problems began. His car had technical issues, and he dropped down the order. In the closing laps, he was fighting to get back to fifth place, the position he needed for the championship. "Come on, Lewis," Mrs. Taylor whispered, clutching her husband's hand tightly. But it wasn't to be. Lewis finished seventh, missing the championship by just 1 point to Kimi Raikkonen. The Taylors were heartbroken for him. Mrs. Taylor immediately picked up the phone to call Anthony, but all lines to the Hamilton family were busy with reporters trying to get comments. The next morning, there was a knock at their door. Lewis stood there, looking tired but smiling. "I wanted to come see you before all the team meetings start," he said, as they invited him in. "I know you'll be straight with me." "You were magnificent," Mrs. Taylor told him firmly. "There will be other chances." Lewis nodded, accepting a cup of tea. "Next year will be different. I've learned so much this season." He was right. The 2008 season was even more dramatic. Once again, the championship came down to the final race in Brazil. This time, Lewis needed fifth place to beat Felipe Massa to the title. The Taylors' living room was even more tense than the year before. As the final lap began, Lewis was in sixth place, not enough to win the championship. "It's slipping away again," Mike said, his voice breaking. Then, in the very last corner of the very last lap, Lewis overtook Toyota's Timo Glock to snatch fifth place and the world championship. The Taylors erupted in joy, jumping up and down, hugging each other. Mrs. Taylor was crying, Mr. Taylor was shouting, and Mike was dancing around the room. That Christmas, a card arrived from Lewis. Inside was a photo of him with his championship trophy. He had written, "To all the people who supported me on this journey, this belongs to you too." The Taylors placed it carefully on their mantelpiece, next to the small trophy Lewis had shown them after his very first kart race all those years ago. Time seemed to speed up after Lewis became world champion. The years that followed brought changes for everyone. Lewis moved from McLaren to Mercedes in 2013, a decision that surprised many but would prove brilliant in the long run. The Taylors watched his career from a growing distance as his fame took him further away from Stevenage and into a world of global celebrity. They still received Christmas cards and occasional phone calls. Once or twice a year, Lewis would visit when he was in England, usually with a gift for Mrs. Taylor's birthday or their anniversary. But these visits grew shorter and less frequent as his schedule became more demanding. In 2014, Mr. Taylor retired from his job at the Ford garage. After 35 years as a mechanic, his hands were stiff with arthritis, though he still liked to tinker with cars in their garage. "I wish I could have worked on one of Lewis's Formula One cars," he joked to Mrs. Taylor, "just to see what all those buttons do." That same year, Lewis began a remarkable run of success with Mercedes. The Taylors watched proudly as he won championship after championship, breaking records that had seemed untouchable. Their home had become something of a shrine to Lewis's career. Photos from his karting days hung alongside newspaper clippings of his Formula One victories. Mrs. Taylor had carefully framed the ticket stubs from the British Grand Prix they had attended as his guests. Sometimes neighbors would ask about their connection to the famous driver. "Is it true you used to drive him to races?" they would ask. "We did," Mr. Taylor would reply modestly. He was just a normal boy with an extraordinary talent. When Lewis faced criticism in the press for his lifestyle or comments, the Taylors always defended him fiercely. "You don't know him like we do," Mrs. Taylor once told a neighbor who had repeated some tabloid gossip. "That boy has worked harder than anyone to get where he is." In 2019, Mike Taylor, now married with children of his own, brought his 6-year-old son to visit his grandparents. "Who's that?" the boy asked, pointing to a photo of Lewis on the wall. "That's Lewis Hamilton," Mike told him, "the greatest racing driver in the world. And he used to sit right where you're sitting now, eating your grandma's cookies." The boy's eyes went wide. "Really? You know Lewis Hamilton?" Mr. Taylor smiled. "We've known him since he was just a bit older than you. Grandpa even helped fix his go-kart," Mike added, winking at his father. Sometimes the Taylors would catch glimpses of Anthony Hamilton on TV in the Mercedes garage. He still attended many races, supporting his son just as he had back in the karting days. They had lost touch with Anthony over the years, but they were glad to see he was still part of Lewis's racing life. In 2020, Lewis equaled Michael Schumacher's record of 7 world championships. The Taylors celebrated with a small cake decorated with the number 7. "I always knew he would do it," Mrs. Taylor said as they watched the podium ceremony on TV, "even back when he was just a little boy talking about Ayrton Senna." "He's surpassed even Senna now," Mr. Taylor replied. "He's in a class of his own." As the years passed, the Taylors settled into a quiet retirement. They still followed every Formula One race, scheduling their weekends around the Grand Prix calendar, just as they had when Lewis was starting out. In early 2021, Mr. Taylor began experiencing unusual tiredness. At first, he blamed it on age. He was in his 70s now. But when he found himself short of breath after just walking up the stairs, Mrs. Taylor insisted he see a doctor. "It's probably nothing," he assured her. "Just getting old, that's all." But the look on the doctor's face after the first round of tests told a different story. More tests were ordered, specialists were consulted, and finally, a diagnosis was given. Mr. Taylor sat in the hospital room, holding his wife's hand as the doctor explained the condition and the treatment options. Some treatments were covered by their insurance, but the most promising ones, the experimental procedures, were not. "We'll find a way," Mrs. Taylor said firmly on the drive home. "We always have." That night, Mr. Taylor stood in their living room, looking at the collection of photos and mementos from Lewis's journey from kart racer to global superstar. "Quite a ride we had, wasn't it?" he said softly to himself. Mrs. Taylor came and stood beside him, slipping her arm through his. "The ride isn't over yet, James," she said firmly. "We'll get through this too." The next few weeks were a blur of hospital visits and medical terms that seemed designed to confuse rather than explain. Mr. Taylor's condition was rare. a type of heart disease that was causing his heart muscle to gradually weaken. The standard treatments would help manage it, but the doctor at Lister Hospital in Stevenage wasn't optimistic about a full recovery. There are some newer treatments showing promise, Dr. Patterson had explained during their last visit, but they're still in the clinical trial phase, not yet approved for general use. And not covered by our insurance, Mrs. Taylor added quietly. The doctor nodded sympathetically. I'm afraid that's correct. The cost for participating in these trials can be substantial. On the drive home, Mr. Taylor stared out the window at the streets of Stevenage. They passed the neighborhood where Lewis had grown up, which now had a small sign acknowledging it as the hometown of the Formula One champion. We should call Mike, Mrs. Taylor said, breaking the silence. He needs to know what's happening. Mr. Taylor nodded. Let's not worry him too much. Just tell him it's a heart condition that we're managing. That evening, after speaking with their son, Mrs. Taylor sat at the kitchen table with a notepad, calculating numbers. Their retirement savings were modest. The house was paid off, but they lived carefully on their pensions. The experimental treatments would cost more than they had. Maybe we could sell the car, Mr. Taylor suggested, watching his wife's worried face. And how would we get to your appointments? She replied gently. No, there must be another way. Mike called back the next morning. I've been thinking, Dad. What about asking Lewis for help? He's worth millions now, and you two did so much for him. Mr. Taylor's response was immediate and firm. Absolutely not. We didn't help that boy to get something back later. But he'd want to know. I'm sure he would help in a heartbeat. That's not the point, son, Mr. Taylor explained. What we did because it was the right thing to do. Not for any reward, Mrs. Taylor agreed with her husband. Lewis has his own life now. We haven't been close in years. It wouldn't be right to suddenly appear asking for money. The discussion ended there, but the problem remained. Mr. Taylor began the standard treatments, taking medications that made him feel tired and dizzy. There were good days when he could putter around the garden or watch a Grand Prix without falling asleep. And there were bad days when walking to the bathroom left him breathless. Mrs. Taylor watched her husband grow weaker with each passing week. At night, she would look through her old scrapbooks of Lewis's career, remembering the excitement of those early days. Sometimes she would pause at photos of her husband helping with Lewis's cart, his hands strong and sure as he adjusted the engine or tightened the wheels. One evening, their neighbor Mrs. Wilson stopped by with a casserole. Thought you might like. A break from cooking, she said kindly. How's James doing? He has good days and bad days, Mrs. Taylor replied. Today's not so good. Mrs. Wilson nodded sympathetically. My cousin had heart problems too. She ended up going to that special cardiac center in London. Saved her life. It did. The Wellington. We've heard about it. But it's private. Our insurance won't cover it. After Mrs. Wilson left, Mrs. Taylor looked up the Wellington Cardiac Center online. It offered exactly the kind of experimental treatments Dr. Patterson had mentioned, including a new procedure that had shown remarkable results in cases like James's. The cost made her heart sink. That night, she sat beside Mr. Taylor's bed as he dozed fitfully. His face looked pale against the pillows, and his breathing seemed more labored than usual. "We need to talk about options," she said, when he opened his eyes. "The Wellington Center in London." "Sarah," he interrupted gently. "We've been over this. We can't afford it. What if we took out a loan against the house?" Mr. Taylor shook his head. "And leave you with debt if something happens to me? No. Then, what about asking Mike for help? He's just started his own family. He's saving for his son's education. We can't ask him to take on this burden." Mrs. Taylor fell silent, fighting back tears. In the quiet room, she could hear the ticking of the clock they'd had since they were first married. On the bedside table sat a small framed photo of Louis from his karting days, grinning with his first trophy. The next day, while Mr. Taylor rested, Mrs. Taylor pulled out all her scrapbooks and spread them across the dining table. Years of memories laid out in newspaper clippings, photos, and race programs. The story of a boy who had achieved his dreams, partly because people had believed in him enough to help. She ran her fingers over a photo from Italy, where they had taken their family holiday to coincide with Louis's race. In it, they all looked so young and full of hope. Mr. Taylor stood with his arm around Louis, both of them smiling at the camera. "We were just doing the right thing," she whispered to herself. "And now we need someone to do the right thing for us." Mrs. Taylor was startled by a knock at the door. She quickly wiped her eyes and went to answer it. A young woman stood on the doorstep, notebook in hand. "Mrs. Taylor? I'm Emma Parker from the Stevenage Gazette. I'm working on a story about local connections to Lewis Hamilton. Your name came up in my research." Mrs. Taylor hesitated. They had declined interviews over the years, preferring to keep their connection to Louis private. "I'm sorry, but this isn't a good time," she said, starting to close the door. Please," Emma said quickly. "I've heard you and your husband were important in Louis's early career. People in the neighborhood still talk about how you drove him to races when his dad couldn't. It's a wonderful story of community support." From the bedroom, Mr. Taylor called out, "Who is it, Sarah?" "A reporter from the local paper," Mrs. Taylor called back. "Asking about Louis." "Well, invite her in for a cup of tea," Mr. Taylor responded. "No harm in chatting about the old days." Mrs. Taylor sighed but opened the door wider. "Would you like some tea?" Emma sat at the kitchen table while Mrs. Taylor prepared the tea. She looked at the scrapbooks still spread across the dining room table. "Did you collect all these?" she asked, amazed at the extensive collection. "Every article I could find," Mrs. Taylor confirmed. "From his first kart race all the way to his 7th World Championship." Mr. Taylor shuffled into the kitchen, moving slowly but determined to join the conversation. Emma was shocked at how frail he looked, but didn't comment. "So, you want to know about young Louis?" he said, easing himself into a chair. "What would you like to know?" For the next hour, the Taylors shared stories of Louis's early racing days. They told Emma about the first time they drove him to Rye House Kart Circuit, about their trip to Italy, and about Louis's determination even when his equipment wasn't as good as his competitors. "We were just neighbors helping out," Mrs. Taylor explained. "Anthony was working so hard to support Louis's racing. We had a car and free time on weekends. It seemed like the natural thing to do." Emma scribbled notes, occasionally asking questions. "And you stayed in touch after he became famous?" "For a while," Mr. Taylor said. "He would visit when he could. But he's a busy man now, with races all over the world. We still follow every race, though, don't we, Sarah?" Mrs. Taylor nodded, showing Emma their living room with its collection of Lewis Hamilton memorabilia. The young reporter took photos of some of the earliest items: the handwritten race programs from kart tracks, the childhood photos of Louis with the Taylors. "This is such a heartwarming story," Emma said as she prepared to leave. The local family who helped Lewis Hamilton on his way to becoming a 7-time world champion. After Emma left, Mr. Taylor seemed unusually tired. "That took more out of me than I expected," he admitted, as Mrs. Taylor helped him back to bed. "You shouldn't have pushed yourself," she scolded gently. "But it was nice to talk about those days again, wasn't it?" Mr. Taylor nodded, closing his eyes. "The best days," he murmured, as he drifted off to sleep. 3 days later, the article appeared in the Stevenage Gazette. The headline read, the family who drove young Lewis Hamilton to races when his father couldn't. Emma had written a detailed account of the Taylors' role in Lewis's early career, quoting several neighbors who remembered seeing the blue minivan loaded with karting equipment. She had also spoken to Martin Wilson, who had been an official at Rye House Kart Circuit. "I remember the Taylors well," Wilson was quoted saying. "They were at almost every race, helping not just Lewis but other young drivers too. They embodied the community spirit that makes grassroots motorsport possible." The article included photos from the Taylors' collection and ended with a quote from Mrs. Taylor. "We never expected anything in return. Seeing Lewis achieve his dreams was reward enough for us." What the article didn't mention, because the Taylors hadn't shared it, was Mr. Taylor's illness or their financial struggles with his medical bills. Mrs. Taylor read the article with mixed emotions. It was a lovely tribute to their relationship with Lewis, but she couldn't help feeling a pang of sadness at how distant that connection now seemed. Mr. Taylor simply smiled when he read it. "She did a nice job," was all he said. They thought that would be the end of it, a small article in a local paper that few people would notice. But that afternoon, their phone began ringing. Friends and neighbors called to say they'd seen the IWB article. Former colleagues of Mr. Taylor from the Ford garage called to reminisce about Lewis visiting the workshop. Then, something unexpected happened. The story began to spread online. A Formula One fan site picked it up, sharing it with the headline, "The Unsung Heroes Behind Lewis Hamilton's Journey to F1." From there, it was shared on social media, with fans commenting on the Taylors' generosity. By the next morning, other news outlets had picked up the story. A reporter from a national newspaper called, asking for an interview. The Taylors politely declined, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "This is too much," Mrs. Taylor said, unplugging the phone. "Why are people so interested in something that happened 20 years ago?" "Because people love stories about kindness," Mr. Taylor replied, "especially when they connect to someone famous." Mrs. Taylor worried about how Lewis might react to the article. Would he think they were seeking attention or trying to capitalize on their connection to him? That was the last thing they wanted. As the day went on, the story continued to spread. A TV news van parked on their street, hoping for an interview. The Taylors kept their curtains drawn, feeling embarrassed by the attention. "This will blow over soon," Mrs. Taylor assured her husband. "Something else will come along to distract everyone." That evening, Mrs. Taylor was washing dishes when she noticed a car pull up outside their house. It wasn't a news van or a neighbor's car. It was sleek and expensive-looking, with tinted windows. A man in a suit got out and walked to their door. The doorbell rang, and Mrs. Taylor dried her hands nervously before answering. "Mrs. Taylor?" the man asked politely. "My name is Mark Jenkins. I represent Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team. I was hoping we could have a word about Lewis Hamilton." Mrs. Taylor's heart raced. She glanced back toward the bedroom where her husband was resting. I don't understand. Why would Mercedes want to talk to us?" The man smiled kindly. "May I come in for a moment? I promise I won't take much of your time." Mrs. Taylor hesitated, then nodded and opened the door wider. She led Mark Jenkins into the living room, quickly removing a pile of magazines from the sofa to make space for him to sit. "Is Mr. Taylor at home as well?" Mark asked. "He's resting. He hasn't been well lately." Mark nodded understandingly. "I'm sorry to hear that. The reason I'm here is because the article about your connection to Lewis has reached some people on our team," Mrs. Taylor tensed. "We didn't ask for that article to be written. We've never tried to use our relationship with Lewis for any kind of—" Mark raised a hand gently. "Please, Mrs. Taylor, no one is suggesting anything of the sort. Quite the opposite, in fact. The story was very moving. how you and your husband helped Louis when he was just starting out. From the doorway, Mr. Taylor's voice came, "It was nothing special. Just neighbors helping neighbors." Mrs. Taylor turned to see her husband standing there, leaning against the door frame for support. "James, you should be resting." "Not every day we get a visitor from Mercedes," Mr. Taylor replied with a tired smile. He made his way slowly to an armchair and eased himself down. Mark Jenkins stood and shook Mr. Taylor's hand. "It's an honor to meet you, sir. The team sends their regards." "The team?" Mrs. Taylor asked, confused. "Yes," Mark confirmed. "Including Louis. He saw the article this morning." The Taylors exchanged a glance. "Is he upset about it?" Mrs. Taylor asked cautiously. Mark looked surprised. "Upset? Not at all. He was quite moved, actually. He's currently in Switzerland preparing for the next race, or he would have come himself." Mr. Taylor nodded. "That's good to hear. We wouldn't want to distract him from his racing." "Actually," Mark continued, "I'm here on a matter that might be of interest to you. We've been in touch with a specialist at the Wellington Cardiac Center in London, Dr. Sarah Chen. She's a pioneer in the treatment of heart conditions like yours, Mr. Taylor." Mrs. Taylor's hand flew to her mouth. "How did you know about James's condition?" "We didn't mention that in the article." Mark smiled gently. "Let's just say we have resources for learning important information. Dr. Chen has an opening in her schedule next Tuesday. A car will be sent for you at 9 a.m., if that's convenient." Mr. Taylor frowned. "That's very kind, but we couldn't possibly afford the Wellington. Our insurance doesn't cover experimental treatments." "That's all been arranged," Mark said smoothly. "Dr. Chen is eager to evaluate your case. All expenses will be covered." The Taylors stared at him in disbelief. Mrs. Taylor found her voice first. "Are you saying that Louis—" "I'm not saying anything specific, Mrs. Taylor," Mark interrupted gently. "I'm simply delivering information about an appointment that has been arranged for Mr. Taylor. Whether you choose to accept it is entirely up to you." Mr. Taylor sat up straighter in his chair. "We've never asked for charity. Not from Louis, not from anyone." Mark nodded respectfully. "No one thinks you have, sir. But sometimes life comes full circle. Sometimes an act of kindness is returned years later." After Mark Jenkins left, the Taylors sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Mrs. Taylor spoke. "What should we do, James?" Mr. Taylor looked at the photo of young Louis on their wall. "I don't know. It doesn't seem right somehow. But if it could make you better." "We don't even know for sure that Louis is behind this. Could be the team doing a bit of good publicity." Mrs. Taylor shook her head. "Does it matter? Someone is offering you a chance at the treatment you need." The following Tuesday, a sleek black car arrived exactly at 9 a.m. The driver helped Mr. Taylor into the back seat with careful respect. Mrs. Taylor climbed in beside him, clutching her handbag nervously. The Wellington Cardiac Center was as impressive as its reputation suggested. Dr. Chen was a kind but serious woman who spent over an hour examining Mr. Taylor and reviewing his medical records. "You're an excellent candidate for our new procedure," she told them afterward. "We can schedule you for next week." "And the cost?" Mr. Taylor asked directly. Dr. Chen smiled. "That's all been arranged. You don't need to worry about that." 3 days later, Mr. Taylor was admitted to the Wellington for his procedure. The staff treated him like royalty, and the room was more like a hotel suite than a hospital room. The procedure was successful. Mr. Taylor would need time to recover, but Dr. Chen was optimistic about his prognosis. "With proper care and rehabilitation, you should see significant improvement," she assured them. Throughout their time at the Wellington, the Taylors waited for some confirmation that Lewis was behind this extraordinary generosity. But no direct message came, and no one at the hospital mentioned his name. The night before Mr. Taylor was due to be discharged, a nurse brought in a small white envelope with Mrs. Taylor's name written on it. Inside was a card with a simple message: "Champions take care of their own." Mrs. Taylor showed the card to her husband, tears in her eyes. It was him all along. Mr. Taylor nodded, too emotional to speak. Inside the envelope was something else, a second, larger envelope marked "For later." Curious, Mrs. Taylor opened it and found 2 VIP passes to the upcoming British Grand Prix at Silverstone. "He wants us to come to the race," she whispered in disbelief. Mr. Taylor smiled, color already returning to his face after the successful treatment. "Well, we can't disappoint him, can we? It's been a while since we've been to a track." 2 weeks later, fully recovered from his procedure, Mr. Taylor walked into the Mercedes garage at Silverstone with his wife beside him. Team members smiled and nodded as if they had been expecting the elderly couple. And then Lewis was there, walking toward them in his racing suit, that same smile they remembered from the small boy who had once needed a ride to the go-kart track. "Mr. and Mrs. Taylor," he said, embracing them both. "Let me introduce you to everyone. This is the family," he announced to the team gathered around, "who made me a champion before anyone knew my name. Thanks for joining me till the end. Let me know in the comments from where you are tuning in. Drop your city and country name in the comments. Also, make sure to subscribe to this channel if you love Lewis Hamilton. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed this heartwarming story of friendship and second chances. See you in the next one.